Welcome to Political Musings here on Fishbowl Radio. With me today is Wendy Davis.
Hello.
We're getting a bit of an echo. Can you work on that? All right. Today on Political Musings, we are going to be talking with Wendy Davis about several subjects, but I want to start out with, first of all, Wendy, if you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing and what you have done.
Sure. My name is Wendy Davis. I am a former Texas state senator from the Fort Worth area. I live in Austin now. I served for 6 years in the Texas Senate before resigning my seat to run for governor in 2014. Not a successful campaign, unfortunately. And I certainly look back on that with if onlys in terms of how very different things would be in Texas right now if I were sitting in the position that Greg Abbott is sitting in. I started a nonprofit organization called Deeds Not Words in 2016, which trains young women on how to use their voices effectively to advocate for themselves at their college campuses, at local municipalities, and in the state legislature. And my goal with that really is to train up the next generation of women leaders that Texas, I think, so badly needs. And then a couple of years ago, I joined Planned Parenthood Texas Votes as senior advisor. My role there was to help them craft a new strategic plan, a post-Roe plan for how we will make our way back, and also to help put them on a more secure financial footing. I formally left my employment with Planned Parenthood Texas Votes a couple of months ago and have started a consulting company. Planned Parenthood Texas Votes is one of my clients, as are a couple of others. And I'm just trying to do everything I can to make sure that these organizations that are doing so much good in Texas and elsewhere are getting the kind of support that they need.
Most people know you for filibuster in 2030. I'm still getting an echo. Can you work on that? Um, this is for the board. Sorry, having a little technical difficulties. Hmm. All right. Now, most people know you, Wendy, for your filibuster in 2013 for reproductive freedom against a trap law, which we'll get into later. But first, I want to talk about the filibuster that came before that, which was the public education filibuster. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and why you were doing that filibuster?
Sure. So that was in 2011. In that particular year, the legislature, the Republican-led legislature, was taking about $5.5 billion in public school funding away in a single legislative cycle. And as you can imagine, the consequences of that were devastating to our public schools. We believed that we had an opportunity in a special session to actually find a better funding solution. And I filibustered the bill to force us into a special session in order to try to find a better solution. So that was my first filibuster. In Texas, you can only really effectively filibuster on the last day of a session because you're trying to talk a bill to death before the session ends at midnight on any particular sine die day. And this bill actually came back to the Senate floor after having been amended in the House on the very last day of the session. And that's what gave me an opportunity to filibuster it. So we did kill the bill that day. We were called back to a special session for public school funding. And although there were some really good alternatives put on the table by my colleagues in the state house, unfortunately, they weren't successful. And Texas did cut $5.5 billion from our public schools in 2011, and they've never made their way back. And now, of course, through school vouchers, they're talking about taking, at least another billion away from public school funding. And it's really just so devastating for our teachers, for administrators who are trying to do the work of educating our kids every day. And of course, ultimately, the people who pay the price are our kids, who we have an obligation to educate, and without whom we won't be successful as a state. Our economy won't be as successful as it otherwise could be. And unfortunately, these individuals won't have the opportunities that they deserve to have.
Yeah, I find it extraordinarily bizarre that the Republican Party writ large seems to think that the way to fix a problem is to take money away from it and cut staff. And
Yes,
never known that to fix anything ever.
it really makes no sense at all. And unfortunately, our educational attainment levels that we're seeing in standardized testing are rapidly declining in our state. So we're definitely seeing the impact of the defunding of our public schools. And I remember when I was in the Senate and I was serving on the Public Education Committee, someone said to me, I really think that this is about defunding our schools so that we lower the educational attainment of our students. We take away their ability to think critically, and we provide Republicans with an opportunity to hold power because their ridiculous policies won't be getting the kind of critical analysis that they otherwise would. And I remember at the time pushing back on that and thinking that it was just such a cynical view. But later on, I came to believe that that's exactly what's happening. And what I see occurring today with school vouchers is an attempt to drive students into parochial education settings, to essentially insinuate a particular set of beliefs and mores on students in Texas, in keeping with the evangelical trends of what's happening in our state, in order to, basically raise up a generation of students with the framework of these evangelical social norms and political norms, all for the purpose of maintaining power. And I truly believe that today. And I know it sounds incredibly cynical and dark, but I truly believe that that's what's happening.
I the idea that we're just going to get rid of the Department of Education, then that's somehow going to fix something at the national level, it is confusing to me.
Yes, I mean, it's such a terrible thing to do, particularly because the Department of Education at the federal level is tasked with one of the most important duties, which is to fund our Title 10 schools, those schools that are receiving funding, excuse me, I think they're Title I schools. I apologize, that was an error. Title I these are the funds that schools are provided for students who have particular learning differences. Maybe it's a student who has special needs. Maybe it's a student with language difficulties that have to be addressed in order to properly educate them. And it's also for schools that are teaching students who are below the poverty line in order to provide additional funding that's needed for pre-K education and to really make sure that those students are getting the special supports that they need to learn alongside students who have greater privileges in their lives and who come to school more ready to learn than some other students might.
Yeah, that's one of the big problems with the whole voucher idea is that people often point to, well, these parochial schools, these private schools, they're getting better test scores. Yes, but what they don't understand is you have to test to get into those schools.
Yes,
They don't have to take everybody.
yes, the process is one that's referred to as creaming, where you're skimming the cream off the top and taking those students into your schools to educate them and leaving those students who have greater challenges in their lives to the public school system. They're more expensive to educate. And unfortunately, the public school system is being systematically starved of the funds that are needed to do that. And when you think about what that means over the long term, it's so, as Benjamin Franklin would say, penny wise and pound foolish,
Right.
because it ultimately will destroy the ability of the state to thrive economically. And it's not something that's going to serve us over the long term. And my heart just breaks for the students and their families who won't be able to realize their full potential if they're not provided with the tools to do so.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to your other filibuster, um, which we thought was tragedy. At that point, we had. I guess I've seen Dobbs coming for about 40 years. and, and watched, particularly here in the state of Texas, our reproductive freedom being chipped away one bit at a time. So, talk a little bit about about that filibuster back in 2013.
Sure. So the filibuster in 2013 was against what were known as targeted regulation of abortion providers. They were particularly unique and stringent rules that were applied to abortion facilities, with the idea, of course, that they wouldn't be able to meet these requirements and they would be forced to close. And in fact, it was the case that had that bill passed in its entirety and been allowed to be implemented in its entirety, of the 42 medical facilities that were providing abortion care in Texas, only 5 would have remained open. And it was unconstitutional, to address these facilities in a way that was different and uniquely rigorous vis-a-vis other medical facilities in the state. But nevertheless, of course, constitutionality has certainly never stopped the state of Texas from doing what it hopes to do. And so I filibustered the bill. It was, again, the last day of a regular session. And I was so grateful for the fact that my dear friend Cecile Richards and others really utilize their organizing talents and skills to spread the word. People had been coming from all over the state to testify in our committee hearings. And then on the day that I filibustered the bill, there were thousands of people who showed up at the Capitol. It was actually the first time and only time in the Capitol history that it had to be closed because it filled to capacity. And still people came and were, outside on the Senate lawn. And we did kill that bill. We killed it as a team, which is my favorite thing about the consequence of that day, because I think it shows us that when we decide to show up, even though we may believe that it won't really matter at the end of the day, it does. It truly does. And we were taught that lesson that day because the Republican colleagues in the Senate had called a number of strikes. We'd had, an hour and a half of parliamentary debate over whether my filibuster had been appropriately called to an end. And ultimately, at about 15 minutes before midnight, the president of the Senate made a call that my filibuster was indeed appropriately called to an end. And the people who had been there all day, respecting the rules of decorum in the Senate, they rose and, cried out with all their might against what they knew
Yeah,
to be an injustice. And it was
I was
really
out in the rotunda with Cecile Richards and thousands of others yelling bullshit when they I- picture this, folks. The Texas Capitol is made famously of pink granite. And the floors are poured terrazzo, which is like a concrete. That building, the voices were so loud it shook.
true. I could feel it under my feet. The Senate floor is actually a false floor built so that the the senators are in a declining row as you lead up to the dais where the president of the Senate, the lieutenant governor, is. And because of that false floor, when that outcry happened, I literally could feel it shaking underneath my feet, which was just incredible, and there were people, of course, being hauled out by some of our security there, and they were just, refusing to go. They weren't doing anything that was threatening or, would have endangered anyone there. But they were speaking out because they knew that the rules had been violated in order to bring my filibuster to an end. And it was their voices really that prevented the vote from being taken before the clock struck midnight that night. It became known as the People's Filibuster, appropriately so. And again, I apologize, my dog. Again, it was just a reminder that we really do have power when we come together. And I think in the moment that we're in right now, I know we're all feeling just so discouraged and upset and um, feeling a bit powerless about what's happening in federal government and all of the horrific outcomes that have occurred in less than 90 days of President Trump's second administration. But I believe in our power. I believe in our collective ability to come together, number one, to speak up and speak out about what's happening, but also our collective power to do something about it at the election box. And that's the most important tool that we have, in a moment like this, is to speak our values and speak them loud and clear when we go vote in 2026.
Let's talk about what is because we had Dobbs happen in 2022 that effectively made all abortions illegal. And we've seen some of the fallout. So let's talk about what some of the fallout is and what efforts are being done positively and negatively going forward.
Sure. So Texas abortion ban is among those of states who have been extremely strict in the passage of their bans. Unfortunately, Texas tends to set the model for how to be the most severe. The abortion ban in Texas has no exception for rape and incest. In the year after the ban went into place, there were more than 26,000 rape-related pregnancies in our state. Um, Many of those, unfortunately, from minors under the age of 18, and even some who were under the age of 12. Um, we do not have an exception in our state for fatal fetal anomaly. And we've seen, that play out in a very tragic way. I faced a fatal fetal anomaly in a pregnancy that was very much desired in my life. And I know how painful and grief-stricken that decision can render a person who makes it out of love, to spare the suffering and sure death of the fetus that they're carrying. And to have the state intervene in such a private decision is just horrific. It's almost like Dan Patrick and Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton are standing in your doctor's waiting room with you, telling you what you must decide in one of the most personal and consequential decisions that you'll ever make in your life. And it's just wrong. And then, of course, Texas does purportedly have an exception for the life of the mother, but it's been written so vaguely, and the consequences of violating it are so high. If you are a doctor who is found to have violated that law, you not only are subject to tremendous financial penalties and losing your license, but you also are subject to spending the rest of your life in prison. So doctors and hospital administrators have been terrified of providing that care. Thanks to the excellent reporting of ProPublica, we've learned that at least 3 women have died as a consequence of not receiving care when they were experiencing a miscarriage because their doctors were so afraid to provide it to them. We, of course, have heard countless stories from other women who have come close to death as a consequence of the vagueness of that exception. And the lesson learned, of course, is that these exceptions just don't work, even when they are written into the law, because it's all about who gets to interpret them. Right now, there is an effort underway. Speaking of the power of people, there is an effort underway in the Texas State Legislature to clarify that exception, to give doctors more clear guidelines for when they can intervene. And I'm hopeful that it's going to pass into law. There are some problems with the bill as it's currently written, and I know there's some attempts to amend it in order to resolve those issues. But I am hopeful that at least in this particular instance, we're going to make things a little bit better than they are right now. But it is true that tens of thousands of people had to flee our state to get the abortion care that they need. It is also the case that what we knew would happen is happening, that people who are of low income, which is primarily people of color in our state, who have been unable to afford the means of leaving our state to get the care that they deserve, they have been forced into giving birth in pregnancies that they otherwise would have chosen not to. And in so many of those instances, these are families who are already having a very hard time affording the children that they already have. And it's just a tragedy, all the way around. And what I know from not only my own life and experiences, but also the data certainly points to the fact that when women lose their reproductive autonomy, when we lose our ability to decide when and whether we're going to have children, we lose the ability to charter our own course. We lose the ability to realize, in many instances, the opportunities that we otherwise might have been able to. And I think we're going to see, again, the economy pay a great penalty as a consequence of this, because where women are forced out of the full-time workforce, where they're forced out of the ability to exercise and attain the educational levels that they otherwise would have. It does change not only their own individual economies and their family economies, but it ultimately has a steep impact on the economies of our state and of our country. And again, these long-term impacts are going to be felt. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah. I know so many people, even before Dobbs fell, because the laws in Texas were so strict. One of my friends teaches at a community college in Kilgore, and one of her students had a miscarriage. Because of Texas laws, the doctors didn't want to do a DNC, which is necessary. And so it really was risking the life and health and future fertility of her student. She was really upset about it. Another one of my friends, one of her daughters had a miscarriage. They gave her mifepristone, which is known as the abortion pill, and that is used to clean out the womb after a miscarriage. She was worried when we spoke last summer because her other daughter was pregnant. And she said, "What if something happens?"
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's dangerous to be pregnant in Texas today. It just is. That is the absolute reality. And one of the consequences of this ban that we've seen in our state is that doctors who specialize in obstetric and gynecological care are leaving the state of Texas because they have felt so hamstrung that they can't provide the care that their patients deserve. It's against the law in Texas to actually teach abortion care, which means that people who show up in emergency rooms who are suffering a miscarriage and who are needing a DNC in order to save their lives, people who are on the verge of or who are septic. Their emergency room doctors haven't been provided the training to provide a DNC. They don't know how to do it. And it is also the case that residents who want to do their residencies in OB gynecological care are not coming to Texas and doing their residencies here. And usually it's through a residency that, we get a doctor to decide they're going to become a Texan and continue practicing medicine in Texas. That's no longer happening. And what's going to happen over the course of the next decade is that people with very much desired pregnancies who seek OB-GYN care are going to have a harder and harder time finding it. And we already see in Texas that more than half of our rural communities do not have someone who specializes in obstetrics and gynecological care. And it's just going to continue to spiral downward in a way that's going to have a very detrimental impact here.
Let's talk about how this relates to what's going on nationally on abortion rights. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So right now, 22 states have some form of an abortion ban in place. A few of them have bans as severe as Texas ban. Um, One of the things that's very important for your listeners to know is that not only do we have an abortion ban in Texas, but starting in 2011, the state began systematically blocking federal funding for reproductive health care. Most federal funding for that kind of care flows through state governments, and they disperse that funding. Um, and just to give you an example of the detrimental impact of that, Planned Parenthoods in Texas can no longer see Medicaid patients. They no longer get reimbursements for treating people or diagnosing people with sexually transmitted infections. They no longer get reimbursements for cervical and breast cancer screenings. All of that has been purposefully and systematically blocked. And Planned Parenthood, of course, continues to be one of the most important providers of women's health care in the state and is suffering the consequence of not being able to provide the care to the people who otherwise would be getting it from a Planned Parenthood and who have no other alternatives because, as you know, we don't have Medicaid expansion in Texas, and we don't have we have the highest percentage and the highest raw number of uninsured people here. We are literally the definition of a healthcare desert. And our state has just made things that much harder. That is now something that is happening at the federal level. You're hearing greater attempts to block funding to Planned Parenthoods, to block their Title X funding, which is a contraceptive care program that began under Nixon, a Republican president. And it's a program that has worked tremendously well to allow people of lower incomes to access contraceptive care so they can plan when and whether to have children and avoid unplanned pregnancies and avoid the need for seeking abortion care. It's just such a foolish thing to do. And at the federal level, in an attempt to deliver a tremendous financial blow to Planned Parenthood, they are working to remove that Title X funding to every Planned Parenthood across the country, which will have devastating impacts. They've already paused that funding under the ridiculous claim that they're reviewing the DEI practices of Planned Parenthood to determine whether they've violated those. And people need to understand that this is happening. It's going to have an impact on every state, whether they are blue or red. There are also attempts to completely remove the use of mifepristone in every state, whether they are blue or red, claiming that somehow it is a dangerous drug when it's actually proven to be one of the most safe drugs on the market.
And
Uh,
life saving.
yes, and life-saving, absolutely. So it is a terrible climate for reproductive rights right now. And in spite of, Donald Trump's protestations that he's not going to do anything to further hamper access to abortion care, he absolutely is doing that every single day through this administration, maybe in more quiet ways that aren't drawing as much attention from the public. But it is getting harder and harder every day to control our reproductive autonomy in this country. And it's something that should alarm everyone, whether they are male or female, transgender, or non-gender identifying. It's going to affect all of us. And it's just a tragedy happening in front of our very eyes. And one, unfortunately, of our own doing, because we've put this administration in place and we're now suffering not only the reproductive consequences of that, but obviously right now a devastating economic one as well.
Yes. And meanwhile, while you know who is destroying the economy of pretty much the world with these on again, off again tariffs that never quite went away. They just reduced them and paused the big ones. Um, but at the same time increased them to China.
Yes, the ripple impacts are just so far and wide. It's hard to describe it all in a short conversation. But one of the things, of course, that's most dramatically impacting people in their current economic livelihoods is what's happening in our 401ks. I mean, it's a tragedy. And if you're looking at your 401k right now and you're watching, as I am, the downward spiral of our lifelong investment accounts, it's terrifying. It's terrifying that at the same time that we're seeing our 401ks lose tremendous value, and us lose our ability to rely on them in retirement, we're also seeing these incredible um, tax cuts to benefit very wealthy people, very large corporations, that can only be paid for by taking away Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security benefits. It's the only way they can be paid for. And even with that, they're adding tens of trillions of dollars to the national debt every single year with this budget. And it's just mind-boggling that somehow this administration was able to sell itself as the one that was going to restore our economies and was going to make our personal economic well-being better. Within 90 days, they have literally wrecked it for everyone in this country. And as you point out, Amy, across the globe, it's just breathtaking.
And in addition to all of that, Michigas, is that he let this guy Musk, a billionaire, his biggest donor, with his 20 somethings, big balls and whatnot, take a hatchet to every government institution we have
Yes.
without understanding the impact.
He
And
doesn't he doesn't need to care. He's a billionaire. And I just hope if anyone is paying attention right now, the thing that they're really focusing on is we have these two billionaires right now who are making decisions that are ripping the fabric of our personal economies to shreds, that are firing people left and right who are performing important functions in our day-to-day lives.
who really needs people over the nuclear weapon security? Do we need that?
Right. I mean, they're making really foolish mistakes in their desire to be fast with all of these cuts. And of course, the promised cuts are never going to be anywhere near what Elon Musk said they were going to be, in spite of all the personal pain that is caused by them. And one of the things that I'm most bothered by is the complete immorality of what is happening around the globe, because people every day now are dying as a consequence of funding having been withdrawn from the healthcare supports that the United States government has so long provided to people across the globe. Children are dying every day while these billionaires are cavalierly just taking a pen and striking these programs that were saving lives, and that Republican presidents before them supported wholeheartedly, because not only did they understand our obligation to the shared humanity across the globe, but they understood that it's important for America to earn the favor of other countries. It is one of the things that has made us so strong and so widely supported by countries across the globe, and made us the supreme democracy and the supreme power. It's just, it's unexplainable, and it breaks my heart. It literally breaks my heart to know what these personal consequences are.
Because it's let's be fair, it's much cheaper and more effective to feed people than it is to bomb people.
Yeah.
And it is much cheaper and more effective to stop a pandemic in some other country than it is to wait till it gets here.
Yes. 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 I mean, speaking of pandemics, here we are in Texas where the measles outbreak is getting worse every day. It threatens to be the next pandemic in this country and perhaps across the globe. And we've got this person overseeing our healthcare system who is fomenting the very reason that we find ourselves here. Again, completely unexplainable, completely avoidable, and the impacts are going to be devastating.
I mean, I had exactly four anatomy and biology type classes in college. I've had more than RFK Jr. And
Yeah.
even I know, for example, like it was at least 30, more than 30 years ago. Yeah, because okay, so it was closer to 40 years ago that I had my last kinesiology class. But I remember that vitamins B and C are water soluble, and therefore, if you get too much of them, you pee them out. There are some impacts with the C being too acidic, but it's survivable. But the others are fat soluble, meaning if you get too much, it gets stored in your fat and it gets stored in your liver. And that's why we've seen, because uh, RFK was promoting vitamin A, people are kids with the measles are getting toxic levels of vitamin A because they listen to RFK Jr. and they're getting liver disease.
Yeah, I mean, it's a flim flam man telling us how to preserve and advance our health. And it's ludicrous. And people are already dying as a consequence, and more people will continue to die.
Something else happened on Palm Sunday. There was a bombing in Ukraine by Russia while everybody was in church,
Yeah.
uh, or some of us in synagogues, because what a lot of people don't realize about Ukraine is that back several hundred years ago, Jews were not allowed to live in Russia proper. They were all forced into the area known as the Pale of Russia, which was places like Ukraine and Georgia. And so a lot of American Jews, like my family, are Ukrainian descent. My grandfather on my father's side was from Kiev. And so it's really the other Jewish state. So there was lots of Jews there. It's again the Russians attacking, because the pogroms, they had to bring that back.
Yeah. I mean, I hope everyone had an opportunity. And if they didn't, I hope they'll go back and find it. But I watched President Zelensky's interview on 60 Minutes last night. And, I find myself feeling so emotional about what's happening in his country right now. The fact that our federal government is aligning with a ruthless, murderous dictator against this democracy that has been a longtime partner for the United States, where other Republican presidents have understood the value of upholding these democracies and how it protects our own safety and security. We have one in place now that is actively allowing it to be torn down. When I saw the Oval Office meeting with JD Vance and Donald Trump and President Zelensky, I cried. I just couldn't believe what was happening. And I can't believe what is happening today. And again, President Zelensky calls us to think about the people in his country who are dying at the hands of Russians who have now been allowed to overstep more and more and more what they are doing, the atrocities they're committing in this war, and the children, the innocent babies who are dying as a consequence of it. How can we rest knowing that we're allowing that to happen?
And if anyone is foolish enough to think that Putin will stop at Ukraine, I, I I assure you the leaders of the European Union have no such delusions because they know that, he's going to take Ukraine, he's going to take Georgia, he's effectively already got Belarus and Hungary. He's going after the Baltic states, he's going after Lithuania, the other side of my father's family. And, Poland is a little bit worried because they think they're next too.
Yeah, I mean, and they should be worried. Of course, they should be worried. Um, it's a terrifying situation. It's only going to get worse. And I just imagine the laughing stock that we've become
Mm-hmm.
in Russia. We are just allowing this democracy to be completely overrun, and it will have an impact, a ripple impact all over the world. There's no question.
I feel like we did the reverse Italy. Like Italy started on the side of the fascists and the Axis powers and then switched to our side. We started on the side of the Allies, and we've decided because of the current imbecile in the White House that we should switch over to the side of the Axis powers.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things as we get close to wrapping up our conversation, it can be the tendency in this moment in time for us to just spiral, to feel that things are so bleak and to settle into that in a way that makes us discouraged and leaves us feeling powerless. And I want to make sure that your listeners tap into their resolve, that they tap into their belief and their hope and their optimism, because it doesn't have to be this way. And the more we continue to speak up and speak out, to rally together, to cry out, not to accept that this is the way it's going to be, but to push back as strongly as we can every single day, and to do everything we can to overwhelm the 2026 election cycle in a way that restores some check on Donald Trump's power, to put a Congress back in place who will use their power to check him, unlike the Congress that we see today. We have the power to do that. And we have the power to elect people, even in gerrymandered states like Texas. We have the power to elect people statewide who are going to restore our rights and opportunities. And we need to, step into that place and believe in our ability to do it, and not cede our power by deciding that our one vote doesn't matter, because every one of our one votes added together can absolutely change everything overnight.
That's
And I just hope everyone will own, their place.
Yeah,
And
if you want to see me go off, tell me Well, I'm not in a swing state. My vote doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Every single vote matters. And even if it's, in the presidential election where it may be a foregone conclusion that your electors are going to the other side or to your side, the impact of the number of people that voted in opposition makes a difference.
That's right.
And also, you have all those down ballot races that matter.
It matters so very much.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. We got started a little late, so we went a little over on our time as well. Um, I I think it's so important all the work you've been doing, and I really thank you for being a part of Political Musings today. As I remind everyone, each and every week, get registered, get informed, get politically active, and go vote. And if you don't have anything nice to say, come sit by me.
Thanks so much, Amy. I enjoyed chatting with you.